Oh, I can see the dot. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Voices from the Library video series, which is coming from Southern Utah University's Sherritt Library. And today we have a special treat. We're going to turn the cameras around on librarian Christopher Clark, who normally hosts the videos in these series, and we're going to make him the subject, or make him be the voice from the library for today. So my name is Todd Petersen. I teach in the English department at Southern Utah University, and I've been a guest before on Voices from the Library, and it's a really great chance to share the really cool work that's coming from a lot of different places and gets to be funneled through our library, which is not just a place for books, but it's also kind of a hub for interesting and cool community activity. And so I guess without any further ado, let's turn the camera back on Christopher and have him introduce himself a little bit. And then I have some questions about some of the work that he's doing right now and the MFA degree he's just wrapped up and all those kinds of things. So Christopher, the microphone's all yours.
Awesome. Well, my name is Christopher Clark, and I am the Outreach and Engagement Librarian and Professor of Library Media here at SUU. And yeah, so I am responsible for doing a lot of the events and outreach at the library.
So I want to start with a question that's pretty broad, because one of the things we're going to talk about today is your writing. And it's sort of kind of you've got a day job at the library, and then you've got this other kind of nighttime pursuit, or whatever we want to call it.
Sure.
But could you talk a little bit about the connections that you feel you've got between your writing and your work as a librarian?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that for me, there's always a question for writers about like where you get your ideas, and I think a lot of it just comes down to exposing yourself to a lot of different things, like reading really widely, like just being curious and like researching a ton. So I feel like that aspect ties in really well with what I do as a librarian, because so much of it is involved with research and, whether I'm at the reference desk helping somebody like research a topic that I wouldn't have come up initially, on my own, or I'm having to kind of shepherd students through the research process as they're working on papers and stuff. All of that tends to, and even things like collection development, all of that tends to kind of expose me to a lot of different things. And so I think it becomes like a really great source of ideas for fiction. And then there's the obvious connection of, as a librarian, you like by default get to be around a lot of books, and that in itself is a very, I guess, inspiring and soothing context to be in.
Writers like Ray Bradbury have been notorious. I guess that's the wrong word. They've been stellar advocates of the library. So someone like Ray Bradbury said, look, without a library I wouldn't have been able to do my work. He talks about going to the library itself to write Fahrenheit 451, right? In that great old story where he would use the typewriters in the basement. How do you feel like libraries do support literary endeavor in general? I mean, because people think like, I can get stuff for the internet, I can get stuff from Amazon.com, but there's something else that libraries do, right?
Yeah, well, and then it's important to remember that the two kind of transactions that you mentioned, the Amazon and the internet, they're always kind of like monetized in some way, right? So like with Amazon, obviously you have to pay for a book to have access to it. With the internet, a lot of times, especially if you're trying to find literature or articles or something, as often as not, you're going to encounter some kind of paywall. And the library is unique in that it's there as a public service, as a service to the university, so you don't have to pay to have access to those things. And what that ends up doing is kind of it equalizes access, which means that people who might not otherwise have the opportunity to be engaged with certain kinds of literature or be exposed to certain kinds of things have that opportunity through the library. And I think this was very true of my own experience growing up. You know, we were very, very poor, lived in a very, very rural part of Oklahoma. And this was kind of in the not quite internet days. So my access to the outside world was basically through the public library. And so I think that continues to be true today. And it's also kind of like when you go to a used bookstore, like you get to kind of like browse a shelf at a library and just kind of stumble across things you would never otherwise know existed. Because you're not relying on an algorithm or Amazon to try and tell you what you'll like. There's more serendipity involved.
I love that you said that word. I've got it written down here on my notes for things to follow up. So one of the things I think that's important for creative process is to make yourself available to serendipity,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like there's so many
Yes.
things that happen in a writer's process that's like, I didn't set out to write this, but
Right.
it happened along the way. You know,
Yeah.
kind of like Dorothy and everybody on their way to Oz, right?
Yeah.
And I think you're right. Libraries really help us with moments of serendipity. I wonder though if you could say a little bit too about what's the relationship to curiosity and this kind of structure that you're talking about, right? An open library structure or the opportunity to stumble upon something that you weren't sure that you were looking for, but now that you found it, you were absolutely certain that you needed it. Like that
Yeah.
kind of relationship.
Yeah, well, I think curiosity is very important in just being really open to kind of new things. Again, like going back to the Amazon example, like usually when you're on Amazon, like you're doing a targeted search, right? Like I need these new like hemp sandals or whatever, and that's what I'm going to plug into the search box. And you're missing out on like a lot of different things. When I go into a library, you know, I might start with one research topic and in the process of browsing and looking, stumble across all these other related and interconnected topics. Just to use a very specific example, if I'm browsing the shelf on the second floor in American literature, I might start by looking, you know, for something by let's say Stephen King, and in the process, I'll find all these other, related authors that I might not have stumbled across otherwise. But I think just generally adopting like a stance of curiosity is good and healthy. I think it was Neil Gaiman that said like that, and I'm paraphrasing. I don't know the exact phrase he used, but said something along the lines of writers are just better at stopping and noticing things than other people. It's not like people aren't getting ideas all the time. It's just writers kind of train themselves to stop and pause and really hold on to those ideas. And I think the same thing is curiosity. It's like we're curious about a ton of different things, and so just whether you're writing something or going into the library, just kind of stopping and letting yourself and giving yourself permission to be curious, I think will result in all kinds of like cool connections that wouldn't develop on their own.
And I wonder too, when you were saying, libraries, they're not monetized, or at least not monetized in the same way. I mean, it obviously takes money to run a library, but we've chosen rather than having it be a commercial endeavor to have it be something for the public good. But that sense of what happens when you are feeling serendipity in a place where it won't cost you anything to look into it, does that maybe lower the barriers so that you can say, I might try something I wouldn't try if I had to pay $25 for it.
Yeah.
And then that way somebody might be able to stumble into something, new information or a new writer or a brand new book or an old book where it's like, hey, look, if the cost of adoption is zero for me, maybe I'll go for it. When it's like, I got to watch my pennies, so I couldn't go for it. Do you think that that's something that comes up for people?
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the issues with kind of when you're approaching things like strictly through an Amazon lens or online shopping or something is that because there is like this, there are the stakes involved of you're spending your own money. You're gonna want to almost retreat to what's familiar, what you know, whether it's like the same author or the same genre or whatever it might be. But if you know that's not the case, you're more likely to just be like, oh, this looks cool, and there are no stakes involved. If I check it out, read it, and maybe I love it, or maybe I don't and I put it down, and you know, and there's no loss either way. And I think that becomes even more extended through things like interlibrary loan, where you can get books through other libraries, right? So you're not limited to one collection. And things like, you know, just kind of encountering maybe older authors that are less likely to show up in kind of like an Amazon algorithm, right? Because everything is about like what's new, what's hot, what's trending. But there may be some like authors from, you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago that are kind of speaking to the things that you're interested in, that if you stumble across them in the library, again, you can check them out. You're not going to have to pay $100 to find a rare used copy on Abe Books to read it. And yeah, so I think that definitely plays into it. And I think there's also this I guess it's kind of social construction of like how we view the librarian, and everything is like, shh, you know, or I'm going to charge you a bunch of late fees if you're late. But in reality, in practice, we're all like, for the most part, pretty chill, and are just really glad to see like things get checked out and see them used. You know, because a book needs to be read and like loved and used. Otherwise, it sits and collects dust.
That's awesome. I want to ask a question that may inch us a little bit more toward your own writing. So you were talking about algorithms that govern some of the ways that people are even sort of able to be presented with books or authors or something that they may like. We don't call them algorithms, but there's a kind of gatekeeping that happens a lot of times in literature classes that people may take in high school or college, where there's a teacher who's kind of running the algorithm, making the choices, like Matthew Arnold said, trying to pull from the list of the things that are the best of what is thought and written. And that's how people kind of arrive at stuff. But libraries seem to be a place where people make choices on their own, based on their own passions, their own predilections, maybe on recommendations that they've heard. But there is this thing that kind of goes on, which there's a sort of like formal kind of literature that's sort of approved for classes. And there's this other kind of stuff which we fall in love with. I remember in graduate school, we used to talk about like our secret passions, or like the things we love that we might not tell other people about, detective novels, crime, and all these other kinds of things that were secret. One of those things, I think, for a lot of people is horror. Horror has a few kind of cornerstones, you know, like Henry James' Turn of the Screw, maybe, or some Edgar Allan Poe, but it's generally considered to be something other than like what you might expect in a survey of literature class to read horror novels. Although Hamlet's a ghost story, right? And what is Macbeth except for like a slasher movie, I guess, or something?
Right.
So we get this kind of thing going on. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, because I know that you have just a deep love for reading and writing horror as a genre, but as a thing. But then maybe even think about like what, you know, kind of what's its place in the world as you see it, both as from a writer and a librarian's perspective.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I think horror is one of those genres that a lot more people love than maybe realize that they do, and they might just call it something else. Like there's a pretty famous anecdote, and I'm forgetting who actually said this. So if I think of it later, I'll give them credit. But they were mentioned, you know, trying to explain somebody that they wrote horror, and the lady was like, I don't like that stuff. And he's like, do you like Stephen King? He's like, oh yeah, I love Stephen King, but he's not. Right. So I think like that part plays into it. But I think also it's a unique genre in that I think sometimes the cinematic form of the genre tends to overwhelm the literary tradition, right? And so we, when we think about it, we might conjure images of like, cheesy slasher flicks, or kind of like really gruesome B grade stuff. And that kind of obscures like a lot of really kind of a rich literary vein, that goes from, like you're saying, like Hamlet's Turn of the Screw, on into the present day. Um, you asked about kind of its place for me as a writer and a librarian. And I would say that as a writer, I just find that it's really well suited to speak, to do two things, I think. It's really good as a vehicle for political fiction, right? In a lot of different ways. And to use like some film examples, I think you would see that in like Rosemary's Baby, like dealing with issues of feminism and women's liberation and all of these things, or even something like a lot of slasher movies were dealing very explicitly with the then new kind of Reagan administration, and how this ties in with who are we as a society, like what values do we have, and those sorts of things. So I think it's good for that, and I think it's also good for writing in a secular way about the kind of the religious impulse that we all have. And there's a really cool term for this that Rudolph Otto penned called the numinous, and I think horror kind of can kind of speak to that. And so that's kind of what I find enjoyable and fun about it, as a writer. Plus, I was always just that kid who liked to ick out the other kids and tell those scary stories. There's something just very satisfying about like knowing that you can make people see the world in a different way, and maybe unnerve or disquiet them, like campfire stories. As a librarian, I think that it can be a genre that a lot of people can turn to kind of practice their own resilience as a person, right? Especially at times of high anxiety, especially in times of upheaval. It can, ironically, empathetically practicing like surviving and going through these extreme situations in a fictional setting, can actually have good benefits for you in terms of how you're dealing with these other stresses. And there's been all sorts of like strange neurological studies and stuff, but I would say that those two are kind of the poles that kind of draw me to it.
So horror isn't always just about ick, like you were saying.
Right.
That some ways we can practice feeling these alienating emotions, these things that are really difficult. How might we face down, deal with, address death, external threats?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so often when we take a look at horror, it's a way for us to express the unexpressible, particular horror that deals with monsters, right? Monsters are a
Right,
way
right.
of creating a kind of revelatory moment. What's the thing that scares us? I don't know. But then we start naming the monsters, and we have like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein saying, what we're really afraid of is what we're capable of with science.
Mm.
Dracula, really sets for other people, readers, hey, we were really nervous about the aristocracy and how they might be like, draining our blood,
Right.
and all this other kind of stuff. And till we get to the zombie is another kind of monster speaking to another kind of fear.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really interested to see, what the current world that we're living through, what monsters it spawns, what monsters it creates. I mean, do you have any thoughts, for yourself as a kind of writer? Like, what is right now making you think about, in the realms of horror, terror, the things that might need to be assuaged a little bit, with fiction?
Yeah, so I think the big one, and this is kind of very consciously on my mind as a writer and just as a human being, is the threat of climate change. I think that is something that um, everybody should be writing about in some way. There's this great book, Amitav Ghosh, the Great Derangement, I think is the title of it, and he talks a lot about how like what is our art and our literature going to look like in another few generations. When people are looking to like how are they dealing with this very serious like existential threat. So I think that's going to be a source of a lot of our monsters and a lot of uh, kind of what horror is going to try and kind of mine those veins a little bit. And it already has to some degree, but I think that's one that's very present on my mind. And I think certain subgenres of horror, like cosmic horror, for instance, I think is really well suited for kind of dealing with those, like, what is climate change? It's hard to put a name to it or identify.
Hmm.
It's so big and so complex that you kind of need monsters that are big and complex and unnameable to really, kind of express that.
And someone like Jeff Vandermeer is exploring that territory a lot
Yes, yeah,
in his writing, and I think he was so far ahead of the game that people didn't know what to do with him up front. And now that we're kind of moving into that, then Jeff can just kind of fold his arms and go, see that. And we saw the same thing with the cyberpunk writers
mm-hmm.
of a few decades ago, kind of starting to imagine the world that we find ourselves in right now. I mean,
Right.
there was just a cyber strike on a whole bunch of blue checkmark Twitter users, like top end, like Bill Gates, and
Yeah.
so that's causing people to come into question. Well, of course, Bruce Sterling and William Gibson and others thought through these kinds of things a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe we are in a situation where the horror writers of the moment will be able to kind of look into the future and say, this is one possible timeline, and maybe let's, like you were saying, practice some of the feelings that come with that.
Yeah, yeah, and that's another thing too that I think I would want to emphasize because I think horror sometimes gets a reputation for being like a nihilistic or misanthropic genre, and it can be, but primarily I don't think it is. I think it can ironically be like also a very good way of um, practicing empathy for your characters, right? Because nothing gets your empathy muscle going like reading about something, a mother having to deal with like a rabid Saint Bernard, right, in a small town or whatever it is. It kicks in that muscle. So I think it can be empathetic, and it can actually be strangely optimistic and saying like, okay, like here's the worst case scenario, but we're not in that, right? We're not in that yet. We're not dealing with zombie apocalypse or anything else. So maybe let's deal seriously with the things um, that are in front of us, because we're not in the worst place yet.
Right. I mean, and what's better? I mean, misery loves company, but what misery loves more is somebody who's worse off than we are.
Right.
Right? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, that's fantastic. Let's pivot a little bit to some of the work that you're doing right now. I know
Mhm.
that you just finished an MFA,
Mhm.
where you were working on a lot of different kinds of things, but you kind of pulled them together into a single project. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work that came in your thesis,
Mhm.
kind of some things that you're thinking about that you are proud of. But then I think that people want to hear a little bit about what somebody would go, particularly if someone was gainfully employed
Mhm.
and doing some good work. What happened to give you the decision to say, you know what, I'd love to go back to school and I'd love to really focus in on this MFA, because it wasn't for professional gain, it was
Right.
for personal development and artistic and creative development. So it's really kind of two things that I'm asking for. Hey, I'd love for everybody to hear a little bit more about your writing,
Yeah.
because I've seen some of it and heard you read some of it before, but maybe the people who are watching Voices from the Library kind of don't know what you're up to. And then that second thing, what motivated you to kind of pursue that degree, and maybe that can help some people if they're considering something similar for themselves.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. So to the first part of that question, my thesis was titled "Come Out the Other Side Okay," and it was basically kind of like a mini collection that consisted of a short story and then a longer novella. The short story was kind of me in my science fiction mode, and it was very much this alternate history, like 1980s coming of age space travel story. And and that was one that I very intentionally wanted to write against nostalgia in a way, and kind of write honestly about like what was it like to be in the 80s without like, without the like falling into the trap of like just tugging your nostalgia strings, right? And showing how this idea of how like like the future is not this set thing, right? Like the choices we make now could like change any number of things. So that's kind of what I was toying with there.
So things like Ready Player One and Stranger
Mhm.
Things really just tried to play on those heartstrings. And what
Right.
you were doing is trying to work away from that.
Right. Yeah. Because I think the danger is that we get this, and we all do this, right? So we all have this kind of idealized, romanticized version of how things used to be, especially, mostly because we were children, and like in whatever the decade. It's like, well, yeah, that was great because I didn't have to work. I didn't have to like work bills and mortgage and all these things. So like, yeah. And we're really good at censoring and editing out the bad stuff, even if there was a lot of it. And so I think nostalgia kind of, in media works in the same way. So that was kind of in my head when I was writing that piece. And then novella was more of kind of like a strange, uh, like detective story. I would almost call it climate noir, and but also kind of dealing with the theme of how the choices we make kind of result in different ends for the world, right? And in our own lives. And that was kind of why I did the thesis I did, because I saw these two pieces and they felt thematically linked, even though they were kind of in different genres and different styles, but they have this kind of thematic cohesion. So that's kind of the story behind that.
By the way, I've heard you say climate noir before, and I don't think I've ever told you this. Every time you say that, I go, that's what we should be calling Blade Runner.
Yeah, absolutely.
Blade Runner is 100% climate noir, and it gets fully realized in Blade Runner 2049. And everybody
Yes.
thinks that it's something and maybe thinks that it's about robots. But even when you go back into the Philip Dick, Duando's Dream of Electric Sheep, it's really about what's this life like when we sort of tap the planet out. For example, like animals are the rarest thing there is. And so the
Yes.
rich acquire them. I think we've kind of lost track of that. So I think, and I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that climate noir is a thing that people are going to start waking up to,
Hmm.
and hopefully finding, like maybe there'll be a call from agents soon that says, anybody got anything that's like in the climate noir space? And you can
Right.
just go, yes,
Yeah.
I'm there.
Yeah, that would be really cool. And yeah, so to the second part of your question about why I chose to do it, I don't know if it was the smartest move for my getting sleep or having any sort of life for the past 2 years. Um, but the reason I did it is because I knew that the MFA program would improve me as a writer, and I think like you'll read lots of writing advice, and I feel like 90% of it will boil down to like sit down and write, which is 90% of it. But I was at kind of like 90%, like I could do that. But I knew I needed to have a dedicated space where I could be around other writers and learning from other writers, both writers in my peer group and those who have been publishing for decades, to kind of get to that next level. So it really was just a personal decision to say, okay, this is worth 2 years of dedicated time to make these sacrifices in playing video games or like going out all the time or whatever it was, to know that at the end of it I can be a better writer and have kind of a better sense of what I want to say.
So you chose, there are a lot of ways that people can proceed through graduate study in the arts in general, but in creative
Mhm.
writing. And one of the things that MFA programs have done for years is low residency programs,
Mhm.
recognizing that writing on its own, I mean, the classroom environment is not always the best for creative writing, because you're going to have to go sit aside and do the work and then gather and share the work. And that's the kind of thing. And so you were in a thing where you would do a residency for a certain period of time every semester and then write with check-ins with faculty. Is that how that would go? Did you also check in with other students?
Yeah, yeah, that's we'd have our 10-day residencies in the summer and winter where we'd met, and it's very intense workshopping and seminars and that sort of thing, and it's a bit of a whirlwind. But the remainder of the time in between residencies, you're kind of responsible for producing a certain volume of work of a certain quality, and so if people are considering like an MFA program, I think a low residency is a great option because as long as you're somebody who knows that they can be accountable and set aside the time, and in terms of like who I'm checking in with, like at the residencies you do definitely develop kind of a cohort of like whether it's people in your own incoming class or others in the program. You kind of you start to nerd out about the same things, and it's kind of this unique experience where you realize like, oh, these people are as geeky about writing as I am, and so you kind of swap things, Slack channels and emails, and we'll like occasionally workshop pieces and that sort of thing. So yeah, so we definitely kept in touch in the interim while the program was going, and still keep in touch.
It's fantastic. So now that you've kind of gone through the 2 years of the MFA and come out the other side, pun intended, what kind of project are you looking forward to or working on right now? Are you still kind of involved with the two pieces you walked us through that were in your thesis, or do you have other ideas that you're starting to kind of lay the groundwork for other projects and the like?
Yeah, so I have this bad habit of and I'm the same way as a reader. I will have like 6 different projects going on at once, and so in various stages of completion. I've continued to really. So the pieces of my thesis are kind of in its state where I'm revising them to send out, and then I have some other short fiction that's almost done. In terms of like bigger projects, I am working on a novel right now that is kind of this weird, like cross-genre, like science fiction horror piece that is also about the grunge music scene in the 90s. So
oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's kind of like where my like kind of long project thinking is at the moment. But I also find that I really, really enjoy the novella format because I really like character and I really like atmosphere. And that gives me just enough space to do it properly. So I've got a couple of novellas that one's almost finished and the other is about halfway done. So yes, I'm just kind of like dividing my energy between these different.
I would love to see literary culture re-embrace the novella.
Mm-hmm.
It's been so great in the genres, right? I mean, with the exception of fantasy, the world building in fantasy is often so intense that a novella doesn't really open it up unless you start reframing some of those great old pulpy, like the Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melniboné.
Yeah.
Those little kind of collections of stories or whatever are really novella length. I mean, the books are just so skinny and you can just blow through them. But I do think that there's something to be said for things like The Haunting of Hill House, Shirley Jackson, or other kinds of things. That's just such an amazing space. You can start something, you can build. I've written one novella, but it was a way to say there's an intermediate length.
Mm-hmm.
And Hitchcock has said some pretty cool stuff about the short story being kind of the ideal form for the film or whatever. But I've always felt like the novella feels like it stretches out to film length, and so many people are accustomed to films as getting their stories through films, and that's kind of the right length. It doesn't have to be a whole like Marvel Cinematic Universe versus movies. You can kind of do something in a space and then hit it and quit. And that I think that would be would be really great if we could see a return to that.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the cool stuff happening in terms of novellas is through a lot of kind of smaller presses that are kind of open to that length. But I think one of the reasons I enjoy it is kind of going back to what you were asking about earlier. Is I think it's particularly well suited to horror because it's so easy to deflate tension over, like, if you
Right.
get to a like novel length, like you have to work really hard to like keep ramping up tension. But novella length, that's perfect for it.
And that the story demands that unity of effect, but you can really kind of turn corners on people in a novella as well, which
Absolutely.
is which is really pretty fun. So the last question that I wanted to talk about is where you feel like you're gonna head in the future. And you can see that I'm hesitating with the question because I feel like I get it right in my head and then I kind of back for it. So I know the projects that you're thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
You're now with your MFA in hand and your thesis in place. You're kind of like in Dungeons and Dragons when you would kind of have like a a thief cleric, I guess I could say, for us, the thing that would never
Yeah.
happen, like a multi-class character.
Right.
Um, I guess that would have been the better way to do it. You're now a multi-class character,
Yeah.
Christopher. You're a librarian writer or a writer librarian. What do you feel about kind of emerging into the world, being someone who has skills and competencies in this one area and
Mm-hmm.
skills and competencies in this other area, and what does it mean to kind of move forward with this kind of and I wouldn't say split or divided, but I would say that you're kind of now two powerful things. And what's that like to just sort of figure out how to move forward? Or maybe that's a too heady of a question because the I think the new car smell is still in your MFA degree and
Yeah.
everything. So
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good question because I think I think there's this tendency to, like, maybe and I think and I wonder to like what degree we do this with our students, right? That we emphasize like uh, kind of almost hyper specialization, right? So like you find that one thing that you're good at, or that you like, and then you do that almost to the exclusion of like all these other possibilities. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I also find that like the librarianship and the writing feed each other in interesting ways that totally work for me. I also have a really short attention span, so that's one of the reasons I work on a bunch of different projects at once. And I think it's important, like if you're creative, to have kind of these other outlets so you don't get burned out. And I feel like the work I do as a librarian is a really good outlet. Lets me be curious, lets me just like research all these odd things that then kind of close this loop informs the writing and vice versa. Um, and also just kind of like, doing things that I will never have a degree in or ever pursue professionally, just kind of making it part of my life. Like, and you, you know, it could be like as simple as like, I really love like writing movie reviews, or like, like, or just a post on like Letterboxd or IMDb or whatever. Or I just like doodling, right? I'm not any good at it, but like doodling is fun. So I think just like, I would say that it doesn't ever feel like a divide or like a tension there. That everything you do has the potential to feed creatively into into your writing or whatever your kind of creative pursuit is. And yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the question.
no, I mean it makes. I was just wondering now. You weren't doing the MFA to replace
Right.
something, and so now I just was starting to get to thinking what is the new hybrid Christopher Cart going to be like? And I think that you talked a little bit about that, and you maybe suggested that in the future there might even be more complex hybridity, where it's not just a writer librarian, but it's a writer librarian doodler, or a writer librarian doodler gamer, or and then we say over a lifetime, a person may pursue or absorb or develop a whole host of creative activities, because that's what feels right. And I thought maybe as one of the voices coming out of the library, this could be a thing that says, and you want to know one of the places that can help you like achieve those things is to go to the library, right? Because there's that lower cost, there's that chance for serendipity, and there's that chance that you could go to the library and come out and say, I had no idea I was interested in succulents.
Right, exactly. And I think
And
I
now I'm crazy for it.
right. And I think it's something that we used to do more naturally, well, you know, back in the day. I hate that phrase, but it's the one that's coming to mind.
You're such an old man.
Yeah, it's well, like I'm thinking of somebody like William Morris, right, who was an author, you know, was into architecture and art, and you know, was an activist. There were so many components to him as a person. And you know, he used to dream of these kind of like socialist utopias where like everybody's needs are met, and then you just like make art and give it away for free, and like it, you know, and all of these things. And then I think when like, especially with kind of like Ford and the assembly line thinking, right, that came along with it, that we tend to think that I need to find the one thing I'm good at or the one thing I'm going to do. But I think for a lot of us, we have like multiple passions, and it can, and like, even if nothing monetarily comes from it, sometimes it can just be satisfying to kind of pursue those. So I would say, yeah, I think that's kind of where my dual citizenship.
It's so great, I think, to have models of possibility, like to see someone like Michael Chabon take on being the showrunner for the Picard show. And it's like, man, this guy's making some pretty great television, when he hadn't sort of been in that space before. Or somebody like Donald Glover, who does acting work in television. Whoa, wait a minute, he's Childish Gambino. Hey, wait a minute, he's writing Atlanta. And you just kind of see him show that he's got these amazing things that he can do. Or Steve Martin, here's this zany comedian. Wait a minute, he writes novels. Hey, wait a minute, he's a really good banjo player. And you can just see in someone like Steve Martin or any of these other people that they really are good at many things. And I think that that's encouraging for us to see people who didn't just kind of drill down into one thing, but started to show, hey, I'm a complex individual, and being a complex individual is good. And then I like systems, you know, like education and libraries and whatever, that says we support you in striving to be a complex individual, instead of we want to support you in fitting into a demographic slot or a little category or a box that's easy to sell things to, that people might be able to find happiness in their own creative pursuits, kind of like you've been describing for us today.
Yeah.
Well, Christopher, is there anything else that you've got that you're working on that you're like dying to share with the world that I didn't know enough to ask you a good question about?
I think they covered a lot of it. Like I said, other than the writing, I'm starting to put together outreach activities for the fall, and I don't want to spoil anything just yet until I get the promotional materials out. But I will say it's going to be some super cool stuff, and especially if you're into Halloween, we will definitely have some cool things coming up in October.
It is entirely possible that one of those possibilities, and I spoke, and that possibility is he's pretty excited about it.
Yes. One of those possibilities will definitely be very, very exciting.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us on your own video series, Christopher Clark, to tell us a little bit about what you're doing, the man behind the, I don't even know whatever we call it, the man behind the Zoom call. And I wish you luck in your own endeavors and with this video series as you continue to discover new people and create a way for sharing their stories with other people. And it's just been great to get together and chat with you.
Yeah.
So good luck for the rest of the summer. It finally rained today, so we
Yay.
can maybe have real monsoons and kind of get out of all that trouble that we
Yeah,
had with
sounds good.
fires and heat and everything.
Yeah, no, it's been fun. So thanks so much for doing this, Todd.
Absolutely.